One of the fundamental experiences of medical training is the swearing of an oath upon graduating from medical school. For centuries, new physicians specifically swore the Hippocratic Oath. But today, many question whether an oath is an appropriate description of medical professional commitments. Indeed, while the vast majority of medical students today still take some version of the oath, it seems merely symbolic, a form of graduation pomp. Rather than resting on the weighty call of an oath, today's medical professional commitments are based on association guidelines or institutional consensus statements. Yet at the same time, oaths remain and seem to signify something unique to the practice of medicine. Few lines of work, save for the clergy, military, and practice of law, have such moral commitments, in which groups of strangers speak the same words and vow to uphold them. Medical oaths confirm the gravity of the work we choose to do. As Christians, what might it look like to consider oaths as a launch pad for conversation around the moral work of medicine? C.S. Lewis once said that if you could remove the differences among Christian denominations, you would be left with an enormous common ground. The oaths which physicians take, in a sense, mark the mere medicine of all who have chosen to pursue the vocation of healing. Clearly, not all medical workers have taken the same oaths. Many variations exist, especially today as trainees write their own oaths. But the oath remains a gathering place of moral seriousness where Christians can consider what it is they are swearing to, as well as what it is other medical workers are vowing. And while there is enormous common ground there, the reality is that there are distinct visions of what medicine is and what medicine should be, and the oaths we take make known that reality. Therefore, it is worth considering the importance of the oaths we swear, and specifically for us to consider how to think about oaths Christianly. There are 4 reasons in particular we should consider medical oaths important as Christians. First, oaths take seriously the idea of vocation. Vocation comes from voca, literally meaning to call or even to praise. Few today are likely calling upon the Greek gods Apollo and Asclepius, or praising Hygeia and Panacea, as the original Hippocratic Oath's invocation begins with. Yet the point remains that an invocation acknowledges something greater than the one taking the oath. Today, as trainees are encouraged to craft their own oaths, perhaps the pendulum has swung too far, with trainees vowing to whatever it is that they want, to the future patient, themselves, a loved one, or religious figure of their choosing. Whereas the ancient invocations bound the oath taker to the divine outside themselves, new oaths may bind oath takers merely to themselves, leaving behind the notion of being called toward something outside of yourself in exchange for living for whatever it is you find most meaningful, at least at the time in which you took your oath. Oaths, when oriented towards the proper authority, force us to wonder what vocation it is we are called to, and indeed what God we invoke as we take up that calling. Second, oaths take seriously the idea that some practices in medicine are right and some practices are wrong. Not just procedurally, technically, or legally wrong, but always and everywhere impermissible. Killing patients, bribing patients, having sex with patients. The Hippocratic Oath, for example, famously forbids cutting for stone, and yet we rightly do not find ourselves accusing our urologists and surgeons of abandoning their vows or harming patients when they remove a kidney stone. At the same time, however, things once thought obviously wrong and decried within the oath are now becoming in vogue and acceptable. Whereas the old oaths forbade the hastening of death with a deadly drug, growing consensus is allowing for physician-assisted suicide, recently renamed as physician aid in dying, in particular circumstances, in which physicians do indeed hasten death with deadly drugs. The old oaths famously forbid abortion, but obviously abortion remains one of the most heated decision points in medicine, let alone in public life. The point is this: oaths take seriously that some things can be right in medicine and some things can be wrong. When we take an oath, we vow to do one thing and not another. It is worth asking then what it is we are called to do, what it is we are called not to do. As Christians, we recognize that all of life exists within a moral order that allows us to distinguish between acts that are right and wrong permissible and impermissible, not for the sake of moral perfectionism, but for the sake of justice, flourishing, and peace. Insofar as we are living lives of thanksgiving, repentance, and humility, we can perhaps serve as a moral resource amidst a medical culture which appears increasingly confused as to those acts which lead to rightly ordered human flourishing and those that do not. Third, the oath imagines a patient-physician relationship that is sacred rather than sterile, covenantal rather than contractual. When husband and wife marry at the pulpit, the exchange of their vows is accepted as something special and deeply serious, precisely because their act is a covenant and not merely a contract. It is an enduring moral commitment between two mutually vulnerable people that is sustained almost without exception or qualification. Something similar happens between physicians and their patients. And yet this covenantal perspective contrasts starkly to the increasingly accepted provider-consumer paradigm that dominates contemporary medicine, in which medicine has become merely a product which patient consumers seek from providers, and in which consumer-provider relationships can be terminated or fired almost at will. As Christians, we recognize the language and power of covenantal relationships, and how a binding and unswerving moral commitment is fitting to describe the patient-physician relationship, marked as it is by healers entrusted to some of the most vulnerable moments of a person's life. Under an oath, the physician is imagined as a moral agent interacting with her fellow moral agent, the patient, and called to act in the interest of her health above all other aims. Only the language of covenant can support and sustain such a call. Fourth and finally, oaths offer a vision of what it might look like for a particular moral tradition to widely influence the practice of medicine. The Hippocratic Oath, for example, was constructed by members of a minority moral community in the broader Greco-Roman region in the 4th century BC. These early healers felt the need to define appropriate modes of professional conduct amidst other practices they felt to be morally reprehensible. Importantly, the Hippocratic community represented a minority moral and ethical tradition compared to the larger moral culture, and yet their oath persisted for centuries, eventually becoming the standard by which medical workers understood their professional commitments, something akin to what Christianity was and became in the Roman Empire and the history of the West. It may seem as Christians that we are the minority within medicine, and yet at the same time, the distinct ways in which we choose to practice medicine may well establish habits and practices that persist for centuries. What might this mean for us as Christian practitioners? To view opportunities to speak truth to injustices in our oath-taking, and to call one another to a higher standard of care than is otherwise recognized? What might it look like to capture the imaginations of those around us with a form of medicine so lovely and wise and practical that others can't help but pause to notice the difference? What oaths have you taken?